My name is Kendra Hinkle, and I am the museum technician here at Andrew Johnson National Historic Site. Andrew Johnson was actually born in Raleigh, North Carolina, December 29th, 1808, to very poor but upstanding citizens of Raleigh. Unfortunately, Johnson's father dies when Andrew Johnson is only 3 years old, and that leaves his mother very impoverished. As a means to make ends meet and to give the boys better potential for a future, she apprentices them to a tailor in Raleigh, but before long, they have run away from their apprenticeship. Johnson travels around South Carolina, Tennessee, even parts of Alabama before he returns to Raleigh to get his mother. He tries to settle things with the former tailor, who was no longer interested really in the affair. So Johnson decided on a new life in the frontier, and the frontier in those days was over the Appalachian Mountains, and he settled here in Greeneville, Tennessee. He probably was passing through Greeneville, but two rather important things happened. One, he was noticed by a group of girls, one of whom told her girlfriends, "There goes my beau girls market," and it was Eliza McCardle. He did go on to Rutledge, Tennessee for a little while and worked there, but before long the town tailor here had gone out of business, so Johnson within the year came back, opened his shop, married the girl. His tailor shop soon became a thriving place of business. Local townspeople enjoyed coming and talking to Andrew Johnson, and they started debating. He was invited to join the debate team, and he was so good at it that some of his peers told him he should run for alderman. He did, and he won it. So that was the beginning of his nearly 45 years in public service. Andrew Johnson's relationship to August 8th is interesting. Although no real physical evidence exists that we know of that particular date, we rely on William Johnson, who was Dolly's son, one of Andrew Johnson's slaves, who gives two different narratives about the August 8th and the day that they were freed. But one of our main sources comes from a newspaper article in 1871 where Sam, Andrew Johnson's former slave, was serving as officer of the day at an August 8th celebration here in Greeneville, and Andrew Johnson met him and gave speeches and was part of the program at Tusculum. So this is a very good verification for us that he supported that day. Andrew Johnson accompanied a friend to Parrottsville, which in those days was a crossroads of sorts for the drover trail, for livestock and whatnot going to market in Asheville. There he bought Dolly, who was a 14-year-old girl who, again, based on William, asked Andrew Johnson to buy her. He said because she liked his face, basically, but perhaps Dolly knew that he was a politician. Perhaps he knew that Johnson was from East Tennessee, a smaller area as far as slaveholders went, probably a better chance at having housework instead of field work. And somewhere along the line, she convinced him to return and buy her half-brother, Sam. And he did. And this also gave Sam a much better existence than he may have had somewhere else. Whether it was a status symbol of reaching a certain mark in life, there have also been speculations that it was almost, as Dolly suspected, a mercy buying to keep them from a worser fate somewhere else. Andrew Johnson's time in Greeneville was a more progressive area as far as abolition ideas. The Genius of Universal Emancipation had been published here. Some of the schools were rather progressive. And this was an area where slaves would not be subjected to more of the harsh field work. And some people have speculated that Johnson may have purchased slaves as sort of a mercy purchase, if you will, to keep them from a harsher life somewhere else. Andrew Johnson held nearly every political office that you can hold on the way to the presidency, from alderman, mayor, state representative and senator, U.S. representative and senator, governor of Tennessee. And through it all, you see slavery mentioned in speeches. You see evolving ideas about slavery until later on in his career, you see a gradual emancipationist starting to form. He was concerned about the reaction to the way these people would be treated with immediate emancipation, the way they could be worked into society. And by the time he was military governor of Tennessee, reestablishing Union control of the state during the Civil War, he freed not only his slaves, August 8, 1863, but all the rest of the slaves in the state in October of the following year. The Emancipation Proclamation had not covered Tennessee because it was no longer a state in rebellion at that point. Andrew Johnson, in many ways, is a dichotomy. He was a Southerner, but he was a staunch defender of the Union. He was a defender of the Constitution. He believed in the federal government, limited federal government, but he also believed that many elements should be left to the individual states. He was a slave owner, and yet when the time came, he said that slavery is a cancer upon the body politic and it must be cut out. And he realized that one of the most critical means of preserving the Union was for slavery to be abolished. As military governor of Tennessee during the Civil War, he freed his own slaves August 8, 1863, and the remainder of the slaves in the state the following year in October of 1864. August 8, 1863. The two sources that we have for that date come from Will, one of Andrew Johnson's former slaves, Dolly's son. The family was living in Nashville at that time. Andrew Johnson is military governor. Eliza and the children had made their way to join them. Judge Patterson, Andrew Johnson's son-in-law, had eventually arrived, helping some of Johnson's slaves. William says in one account that Eliza called them all in and told them that they were now free. In another account, he says that Andrew Johnson told them of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and that they were all free now if they wished to go, and he said we all stayed. Albeit that there is no absolute documentation that we know of for that day, being the day that he freed his slaves. He did later attend an August 8th celebration in Greeneville with his former slave Sam, who was serving as officer of the day, at Tusculum, and Johnson gave speeches there. So that's an authentication, if you will, of him approving of that date. So August 8th, 1863, that is a relatively early date for emancipation of slaves, as far as Andrew Johnson is concerned. By September of that same year, the New York Times says that Governor Johnson plants himself on extreme anti-slavery ground. Andrew Johnson was a slave owner. His relationship with his slaves seems to have been very familial. We know in instances where he's bringing toys home to his children, he'll say, tell Liz and Florence that I'm bringing them a couple of little chairs as well. Sam seems to have been a particular close, even confidant of the president's. Family tradition holds that Andrew Johnson told Sam where he wanted to be buried, which is behind me at the top of Monument Hill, then known as Signal Hill. We have a letter from Johnson's son Charles where Eliza asked Sam to go cut wood at Patterson's house, so that gives us an insight into some of the tasks that he would have been doing. He said he wouldn't until he'd been paid for the last task he'd done. She essentially told him it would do better to give than to receive, and he said he didn't make half enough know-how. So that gives us some insight. Three different things. One, that Johnson reimbursed them financially for work done while they were slaves. Two, that Eliza was in charge of some of the finances while Andrew Johnson was gone. And three, that there was a very lenient relationship between master and servant in the Johnson household. Andrew Johnson's daughter Martha once remarked that old Sam boasts he is my father's servant, but in truth, Andrew Johnson belongs to Sam. When the Southern states seceded, Andrew Johnson was the only U.S. Senator from the South who retained a Senate seat. And he served with such gusto, if you will, that Lincoln noticed. And when it became time for Tennessee to need a military governor to reestablish Union control here in the state, Johnson was the obvious choice. And he did great work while he was military governor as far as keeping control of the state, and Lincoln recognized that. And later on, when he needed a running mate, this was a Southern Democrat. This was a way for Lincoln to rejoin the two sides of the country to make good on his second inaugural, to sort of bind up the nation's wounds, to bring both sides back together again. Johnson purchased Dolly and Sam, half-brother and sister, in 1842. They stayed on with the Johnson family doing their domestic work. Sam eventually would marry a woman named Margaret and have several children, some born in slavery, some afterwards. Eventually, Andrew Johnson Jr. would give Sam land where he built his own house. Dolly would eventually have 3 children, Liz, Florence, and Will, and Florence went to the White House with them to serve there, as well as a boy named Henry. And Dolly would later live in the tailor shop where she opened a bakery. She would bake and sell pies there. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, who had been his vice president, is now president of the United States. And much of his legacy comes from this time period, which is very complicated. Of course, we know of his problems with Congress, their conflict over Reconstruction and the way the former Southern states should be returned to the Union, the way that former slaves should be treated in their rights. Much of what Johnson did seems in direct opposition to the freedmen, when in a way I would argue that it was his interpretation of the Constitution in trying to keep Congress from enacting policies and laws that he felt were unconstitutional. The freedmen were the one who ultimately paid the price in that. So compromise, if there could have been compromise between Congress and the president. Johnson's emancipation of his slaves. In another speech, he explains that he had freed his slaves, given them wages, and that they have worked better since then for him, and that if other people would do this, this would be a way to help everyone rise. And that if they had the means to further themselves, then let them and help them do it. Johnson saw that emancipation was the way that would lead to the preservation of the Union, ultimately. Even while Johnson was president, you see instances of him. He signed the charter for Howard University. He gave $1,000 of his own money to formulate a freedmen's school in Charleston. And when his former slave Sam wrote and asked for land that they could buy for purposes of a schoolhouse for the freed children in Greeneville, Johnson wrote back and said, have the plat drawn up that you want and I'll give it to you free of charge. So individually, there are many different variations of Andrew Johnson, of the man that we think we know. And I think it is part of his legacy that later on he attended the August 8th celebration with Sam, a way to reach out and bring some sort of mutual understanding between the two. We've done research on August 8th. We have newspaper articles about August 8th through the centuries. And we do have that first celebration in Greeneville where he attended with Sam. And later on through the years, they moved to Knoxville quite a bit. There were players. Louis Armstrong attended one of them. So it was a big celebration, a big to-do in these surrounding areas. The first August 8th celebration that we know of was listed in the Knoxville Chronicle. It was written August 9th, 1871, during which point they say that in Greeneville there was a celebration. A procession was formed in the following order with Sam Johnson, late a slave of President Johnson, the Greeneville Brass Band in 4-horse wagons, suitably bedecked with flags. Then came citizens in wagons, buggies, carriages. Afterwards, the Sabbath school children formed in the procession, all carrying the American flag in front. And they marched out of town some distance when they were addressed by ex-President Johnson, Colonel Bob Crawford, and others. So President Johnson went out about 11 o'clock in a 2-horse buggy in company with several other gentlemen. So as far as we know of, that's the first August 8th celebration in which Johnson was in attendance. I think it's very important that we still remember August 8th today, and I think it is part of Andrew Johnson's legacy that his site still works in partnership with the local community to remember this critical day in the history not only of Tennessee, but in the nation as well. Okay, he was the slave of Elam Carter when he was sold to Andrew Johnson for $541. Andrew Johnson bought Dolly in 1842, and within a short time, he returned to Parisville, which was in an adjoining county, Cott County, to purchase her brother, Sam. He purchased Sam from a man named Elam Carter, and he paid $541. One of Dolly's children married a Forby. So Liz, and then Mary Johnson, Andrew Johnson's daughter, willed Liz Forby, some land next to that occupied by Samuel Johnson. And that would have been off Barton Ridge Road. The role of the Johnson slaves was primarily domestic. William Johnson eventually became a rather prized pastry chef down in Knoxville, and he'd always said that he had learned to cook by the side of his mother, Dolly, and Mrs. Johnson in the kitchen. Sam would have been doing gardening work, the cutting the wood, chores, outdoors, gardening, probably, as we had said. And William even gives us an insight into what he was expected to do. He wrote, "At 4 a.m, I had to be up. I went up and made the fire in Johnson's room, shined his boots, and then made a fire in the kitchen stove. I stood by his side at the table. Then I washed the dishes." So that gives us a very intimate glimpse into the workings of the Johnson household.